Arboreal Grazer can be a powerful magic card when included in a proper shell. Decks with plentiful lands and ways to abuse those mana sources, such as Amulet Titan and Bring to Light Scapeshift, leverage and abuse Grazer to accelerate their game plans and get their opponents dead. But today, we're approaching things from a completely different angle, making drastic changes to an already existing archetype, inserting Arboreal Grazer into the list. But before we talk about the nuts and bolts of this innovative deck list, if you haven't done so already, please hit that subscribe button. Black-green Yawgmoth is and has been a powerful strategy for quite some time, but it is inherently weak to decks with heavy creature-based removal. The old adage, bolt the bird, hits home for Yawgmoth enthusiasts everywhere. But wait, what if we did away with our Birds of Paradise and Ignoble Hierarchs? Today, we're running an experiment, replacing our Mana Dorks with 4 Grazers and upping our land count to 24. We're going to take advantage of Grazer's acceleration by including 4 Colony Gardens, especially synergistic with our Convoke spells, Yawgmoth and Grist. We can bounce Gardens, Takenuma, or Boseiju back to our hand with Golgari Rot Farm, ensuring that we get late game value off of them. Adding extra copies of Nurturing Peatland will help to ensure we don't flood out in the late game as well. Let's jump into our league and see how this innovative approach to Black-green Yawgmoth pans out. Jumping into our league, feeling pretty optimistic about our chances, reveal our opening 7 cards, a little wonky with the mana, but we decide to keep. Opponent leads on a Blood Crypt, shocks, casts a Thoughtseize, takes our Strangled Geist, which we can't even cast. Moving to our first turn, we draw into a Forest, which is an excellent draw. Play it out, cast our Grazer. We're ramping. Opponent's turn 2. They lead with another Thoughtseize, taking our Grist, play out a Proving Grounds, which makes us believe that we're playing against creativity at this point. Our turn 2, we draw into another Grazer, which is unfortunate. Lead with our Takenuma, leave up our Endurance, pass the turn. Opponent plays out a Wooded Foothills, fetches, follows it up with a Fable. At a turn, we're going to fetch, shock to fix our mana, cast out our Endurance, and moving back to our turn. We draw into a Golgari Rot Farm, attacking with our Endurance. A nice hit for 3 puts our opponent down to 10 life. Cast out our Hepatra, cast out our Grazer, put the Rot Farm into play, trigger and bounce our Takenuma. But unfortunately, suspecting a creativity next turn, it doesn't make sense to hold it in hand, so we play it back out. Our opponent's turn 4. They lead off the turn by looting with their Fable. They attack in with their Fable token, creating a treasure. I block with my Hepatra and trade, cast a Dwarven Mine, and followed up with a creativity for 1. Yikes. I opt to sacrifice one of my Grazers. Moving back to our turn, we draw into a Twilight Mirror. Unfortunately, not going to cut it. Back to my opponent's turn. They cast their second creativity, putting another Archon into play, and that spells defeat. I opt to bring in these 4 cards, take out these 4 cards, submit for game 2. Opening 7, not a keep, mulligan down to 6. My 6 card hand has interaction, so I decide to keep it. Opt to put the Court of Calling on the bottom of the library. Lead off with my Peatland into a Thoughtseize, ouch. Take the obvious choice, the Renin 6, and pass the turn. Knowing what's in their hand, they lead with a Scalding Tarn and pass the turn, nothing else going on. We draw into a Forest, play it out. Thoughtseize our opponent for a second time, and opt to take the Necromentia to save our Yawgmoth from future disaster. Opponent fetches end of turn, gets a Proving Ground, plays out their battle, and passes the turn, discarding the Archon and drawing a card. We drew into an Eldritch Evolution, not a great draw. Play out our Grist, plus our Grist, pass the turn back. Opponent drew into another land, playing out the Foothills, and passed the turn back. We drew into our Overgrown Tomb, but in a little bit of a predicament knowing that our opponent has double Lightning Bolt in hand. Lead with an attack for 1 with our Insect. Instead of casting out my Yawgmoth, I opt to Eldritch Evolution, get myself a Strangleroot Geist. Poor sequencing on my part. I hold the Overgrown Tomb just in case my opponent has a creativity on their turn. Pass back, my opponent double bolts their battle at the end of turn, transforming it and putting a 3/4 trample into play. They discard a Bitter Reunion, get themselves a land into hand. They untap, moving back to their turn, leading with an attack, hitting our Grist, play out a Stomping Grounds untapped, fetch, get themselves a Dwarven Mine, And in disastrous fashion, our opponent drew into the abdominal creativity they needed, and that ends the match. Match 2, we've won the die roll, we're on the play. Opening 7 cards acceptable, we keep. Turn 1, we lead on our gardens, make a plant, pass the turn. Opponent leads their turn 1, casting out of plains, into a Sigarda's Aid, looks like hammer time. Back to our turn, we draw a second Yawgmoth, not great. Play out our Innkeeper, pass the turn. Opponent plays Nexus into an Esper Sentinel, passes back. Fortunately, we didn't draw land. Forced into a decision here. I opt to sacrifice my Prosperous Innkeeper, which triggers the Esper Sentinel. Opponent draws a card. Get ourselves a Yawgmoth for some protection. Pass the turn back. Opponent plays out an Urza's Saga and does nothing. Back to our turn, we're feeling pretty good. Drew into a Grazer, not great. We play out our Geist, and like a savage, our opponent manatides us. Brutal. We've got nothing else. Pass turn back. Saga ticks up to 2. Opponent plays out of plains, activates their Nexus, and attacks him with the Nexus. To me, this seems disastrous. I'm guessing they have 2 hammers. They cast 1 out, targeting the Nexus. I try to kill it in response, and predictably, a protection spell comes down, and we lose the game. Game 2, we're going to bring these 5 cards in and take these 5 cards out. Opening 7 cards. We have a Grazer opening hand. We can ramp quickly into a Court of Calling. We're going to keep this. Lead with our Colony Garden, pass the turn. Opponent basic plains, hammer, pass the turn. Turn 2, we go Grazer. Put our Rot Farm into play. Return our gardens. Recast our gardens. Plants everywhere. Pass the turn back. Urza's Saga enters the battlefield. Back to our turn. We draw into our namesake Yawgmoth. And because my opponent showed me Mana Tithe game 1, I opt not to play it. Instead going for Wall of Roots, playing out the Rot Farm, returning the Colony Garden, second Grazer, and even more plants. Pass turn back. I have Chord for Yawgmoth up on their turn if I want it. Saga ticks up to 2, basic plains. My opponent does nothing, I opt to do nothing as well. Back to my turn, I draw into a Blood Artist. Cast out the Catacombs, cast out Yawgmoth. Yawg hits the battlefield. Fetch. Get myself a basic Swamp. Blood Artist. My opponent tries to exile my Yawgmoth in response. I cast Court of Calling. Getting myself a Hapatra. Proceed to draw 7 cards. Cast out my Might. Pass the turn. Saga ticks up to 3, and for whatever reason, my opponent scoops. Game 3. Game 3, I bring in a Fatal Push, cut a Young Wolf. My opening hand is pretty terrible, opt to mulligan. 6 card hand is much better. We keep that. Send back the Verdant Catacombs. Opponent leads Plains into Sigarda's Aid. Ornithopter. Pretty scary start. We draw into a Yawgmoth. Play out my Peatland into a Grazer. We are ramping Rot Farm into play. Return the Peatland. Turn 2, my opponent leads with the Plains, attacks with the Ornithopter, representing a hammer. I block. We could die if we don't block. There's the hammer as expected. Grazer down. Back to our turn, we draw into a Grist. Play out my Innkeeper, make a treasure. Play out my Hapatra, pass turn back. Opponent attacks it with their ginormous Ornithopter. I opt to block with my Innkeeper. Innkeeper hits the bin. I exile my Hapatra, pass the turn. Draw into a Colony Garden. Play out my Grist, play out my Garden. Get myself a plant. And the synergy is off the charts. I sacrifice my plant, killing the Ornithopter. We're in business. Opponent cracks their Horizon Canopy for turn, showing a sign of weakness, into a Paladin. Not enough artifacts on the battlefield though. Play out an Ornithopter, pass the turn back, and now we're feeling good. Plus my Grist. Instead of playing out Yawgmoth, I opt for my Geist, leaving up Besiju on their turn. Opponent exiles my Geist, attack with the Paladin, I jump block, back to my turn. Draw into an Evolution, plus my Grist. At this point, makes sense to play out my Yawgmoth, pass the turn back. Opponent casts some core creature, allows them to equip their hammer on demand, attach it to the Ornithopter. They swing, and that's NBD. No Shadow Spear, so no damage. Block, minus, pass the turn back. Drew into our second Besiju, which is extra insurance, and from here we're feeling confident. Plus our Grist, play out the Colony Garden, sacrifice the plant, get a Geist, and we are in business. sacrifice the Geist, and my opponent concedes in response. We're 1-1. Match 3, we're on the play. The dreaded double Twilight Mirror hand, we mulligan. 6-card hand acceptable. Send back Eldritch Evolution. Lead out Besiju into a Grazer. Combo, put our Rot Farm into play. Return the Besiju. Opponent's turn 1, they lead on blue-red land into a Rag. We draw into a basic Forest. Cast that out. Put our Grist into play. We ain't scared. +1. Opponent plays an Arid Mesa, fetches basic Mountain into a Ledger Shredder. Bobble, trigger their Shredder. No attacks past the turn. We draw a second Grist. Unfortunate we can't cast out our Yawgmoth. Play our Young Wolf, minus the Grist, sacrifice the Young Wolf, kill the Shredder. Bang bang. He gone. And at this point I'm thinking I'm against Breach because of the basic Mountain. I still opt to play out the Besiju. My opponent looks at my top card, improper sequencing. Attack with my Insect. Surprisingly, my opponent blocks. Second main, play out my Grist. An effort to use my mana efficiently, I plus the Grist, milling the card they knew about. Pass the turn. Opponent leads on an iteration into a Mox Amber, confirming that it is in fact Breach. Fetch Shock. Unholy Heat my Grist. Pass the turn. I have a solid draw on Eldritch Evolution. Lead with an attack for 3. Cast Evo, sacrifice my Grazer, get an Endurance to regulate their game plan. Feeling pretty good. Shuffle their graveyard. Pass the turn. Opponent plays out Saga. Shadow Spear. Not much going on over there. Lead our turn, drawing into our second Black Source, we swing with the team. Play out the Overgrown Tomb untapped. The Yawgfather, and good night. Opponent draws return, Saga goes up to 2. Makes a Construct. Casts an Emery. Too little, too late. Hollowed Fountain, equip the Shadow Spear. Don't think this is going to cut it. EOT, we're going to draw some cards. Draw into attack a Numa, minus the Emery. Draw into a Geist, which is infinite with Yawgmoth and Young Wolf in play. Lead Wall of Roots into Geist. Our opponent scoops. Up 1. We are bringing in a ton of cards. 8 in total, cutting 8. Moving to game 2. We are on the draw. Our opening 7's a little slow, but it's definitely a keep. Opponent leads Basic Island into a Springleaf Drum. We start with the secret MVP of the deck, Colony Garden. Make a plant. Pass the turn. Opponent fetches, shocks. Plays out an Emery. Bobble into the graveyard. Pretty good hit. We draw into a Rot Farm. No Grazer to go with it though. I opt for Twilight Mirror. Cast out my Wall of Roots, setting up for next turn. On their turn, my opponent casts a Teferi. Doesn't get to use the Emery. Bounces my plant. Somewhat strange. Drew into a Mountain. Passes the turn. We draw into a Force of Vigor. Start with a Geist. Attack into the Teferi to try to free up my Force of Vigor, and they Unholy Heat my Geist in response. Favorable trade. Play out my Swamp. Play out my Scavenging Ooze. Pass the turn. Opponent pluses their Teferi. Tries to Prismatic Ending my Ooze. I respond by eating their Bobble out of the graveyard. No food for Emery. They fetch Shock into a Grinding Station. Little scary. Pass the turn back. Draw into a Grazer. Not a bad draw. Lead by attacking with the Geist. Swinging at Teferi. Surprisingly, our opponent blocks with Emery. We have a fancy line available to us. Play out our Rot Farm after adding a mana. Return the garden to our hand. Play out the Grazer. Replay the garden. Now we have Cord up for 3. Cord for an Endurance. Hit their graveyard. And we're feeling good. Opponent has 1 card in hand. Opponent sees the writing on the wall, scoops it up. 2-1. Match 4, opening hand. You have to shuffle that one away. Mulligan down to 6 acceptable. A little slow, we'll keep it though. Put back the Rot Farm. Opponent leads on a Dwarven Mine. Opportunity for vengeance here. We lead on our Verdant Catacombs past turn. Opponent fetches, shocks, and predictably Wrenn and 6 comes down. They plus it up. Land back to hand. Not good for us. Back to our turn, we draw into a Rot Farm. Doesn't really do anything. Fetch with our Catacombs. Play out a Sacrificial Innkeeper, pass the turn back. Opponent shocks. Pings our Innkeeper as expected. Passes the turn, representing a Prismari command. We draw into a Grist. Play out the Grist, can't get Spell Pierced. Plus Grist. Play out the Rot Farm. Forest back to hand. Go. End of turn, our opponent Prismari commands the Grist, makes a treasure. Opponent casts their second Prismari command. Dumping down my Grist. Draw 2, discard 2. Discarding Spell Pierce, Ren and 6, number 2. Minus killing my insect. I've got no board. Things are not looking good. Draw into a Geist, timely. As always, play out the Geist, swing at Ren and 6, knowing that a Dwarven Mine is possible. They opt to make a Dwarf, jump block with it. My Geist returns due to the Undying trigger, Ren survives another turn. They minus with the Ren and 6, targeting the Geist, play out another Ren and 6. They really want this Geist dead. Minus and kill it. Poor Geist, what did it do to you? Bloodstained Mire, fetch shock, into a Teferi, and a plus with the Teferi. Back to me. Drawn to a Boseiju, up to play it out. Cord for 2 to get another Geist. Attack, kill the Ren and 6, pass the turn. Strangely, my opponent bounces the Geist with their Teferi, makes a Dwarf, Creativities for 2, Emrakul and Iona, and I have no outs to that, they scoop it up. I bring in 3 Thoughtseize and a Silex, cut these 4 cards. Game 2. Game 2, my opening 7's a little slow, but I opt to keep it. Play out the Garden, my only turn 1 play, pass the turn. Opponent leads Arid Mesa, passes the turn. Back to us, who draw a second land. Solid. Play out the Verdant Catacombs. Fetch shock. Geist. We bang for 2. Pass the turn. Opponent plays out their Boseiju, which if they kept in hand would be pretty strong against what I have. Play out a Ren and 6. Ping my Geist for some reason. Pass the turn. Attack the Ren and 6. Dump it down. Play our land which we drew. Fetch a swamp. Incoming Grist. Plus Grist. Pass the turn. Opponent plays out their second Ren and 6. Pluses to get their third land. Plays it out. Passes back. We rip a Peat land off the top. Attack in Ren and 6. Knock it down. Plus the Grist. Play out Yawgmoth and proceed to dominate. Our opponent scoops. On to Game 3. Game 3, I opt to bring in my Haywire Might, and I cut an Endurance. Game 3, my opponent opts to mulligan, and for that reason, I decide to keep this slow hand with a little bit of interaction. Opponent leads on Scalding Tarn, passes the turn. We rip a Grazer off the top, an excellent draw. Play out our Gardens, pass the turn. Opponent plays a Shockland tapped, passes back. We're in business. Draw Twilight Mirror. Not feeling particularly threatened, I opt for Grazer. Play out the Rot Farm. Return the Garden. Replay it. That's a combo. Pass the turn. Opponent misses their third land drop, passes the turn, and we are feeling good. Drawn to another land. Why not? Let's play it out. Young Wolf. Pass the turn. We have a cord up. They fetch, and I respond. Cord for 4 on turn 3. Back to my opponent's turn. They miss their land drop, and they scoop it up. Match 5 of our league. This is a mediocre opening 7. We're going to ship this back. 6-card hand ramps really hard. We're going to keep it. Lacking threats, but we have a redraw with the Peat land. Get rid of one of the Wall of Roots. Lead on the Peat land into the Grazer. Rot Farm into play. Return the Peat land. Definitely better than a bird in this potential matchup. Hint, hint. Opponent leads Polluted Delta, fetch, shock. Dragon's Rage Channeler. Into a Bauble. That's a combo. Bauble into the graveyard. Look at my top card, pass the turn. We draw into a Cord, which is an excellent draw. Cast a Wall of Roots. Into another one. We got mana, pass the turn. Opponent plays a second Channeler. Does nothing. Back to us. We draw into a Garden, which is also an excellent draw. Play that out. We got mana for days. Opponent only has 1 land up. We're going to abuse this situation. Turn 3, once again we are cording for 4. Opponent fetches in response, gets a basic island, and falls right into our trap, casting a Spell Pierce. Not realizing that we still have wall activations. Played around it. Pay for that Spell Pierce. Get ourselves a Yawgmoth. We'll draw a few cards, looking for an Endurance. Draw into an Eldritch Evolution, which represents an Endurance next turn, pass the turn back. Opponent leads with another Bauble. Murktide and Consider into the graveyard. And they proceed to iteration. Fairly aggressive. Looking for an Unholy Heat, most likely. They shock, attack for 4, and are in trouble. Moving back our turn, an excellent draw. We pull a Geist, lead on the Geist, play out a Peat land to play around Spell Pierce, sack the Geist, opt for an Endurance instead of a Hapatra, shuffle their graveyard, kill both the channelers, and we are in firm control of this game. Opponent takes a hit for 5, goes down to 9. Back to them. Good luck. Opponent draws for turn and scoops. No shot. We're going to bring in these 6 cards. We're going to pull those 6 cards. Game 2. Opening 7 is very strong. We like this hand. We'll keep it. Opponent leads Bobble. Look at their top card. Fetch land. Appears they like it. They'll keep it. Pass the turn. We draw into a Rot Farm, which is a banger of a draw. Play out our peatland into a Grazer. We are ramping on turn 1. Garden into play. We've got creatures. This synergy is so cool. Feels really strong. Opponent fetches. Back to them. Spirebluff Canal. They're representing a counterspell. Back to us. Draw into a Fatal Push. We can wait for a while. Grazer number 2. You want to counter it? They choose not to. Rot Farm into play. Return the garden. More plants. Eat your vegetables, people. Back to you, opponent. Opponent shocks and does nothing. We can sit here all day. Another peatland. I'll lead on my swamp. I'm not going to cast Yawgmoth into counterspell. Pass the turn back. Opponent plays an Otawara. Hold on to nothing. I'll draw a card end of turn. Get a Geist. Draw into Grist. Reasonable threat. Lead on my Geist, hoping to draw out a counterspell. They opt not to. And now we get our beat on. Hit for 2. That didn't sound good. Pass it back. Lead on EI. Play out a land. 7 cards in hand. Nothing else. No threats from their side of the table. Drew another land. We'll swing for 2. There is no pressure for us to do anything. We'll pass. They lead on Shredder. First threat of the game. Congratulations. They consider, channel, or connive, not channel. Fortunately, we have an answer to the Shredder. We'll dump it down. Back to our turn. We're setting up 2 spells in a turn, and we draw into an Endurance. Swing for 2. Beats once again. We'll lead on our Grist, trying to draw out a counterspell here. And, unsurprisingly, our opponent counters it. Now the card we actually wanted to resolve, an Endurance. Shuffle that graveyard. Anticipating this getting heated in response. There it goes. We're okay with that. Opponent leads once again with an iteration. Plays out a Fiery Islet. This looks like a Fury. And a huge mistake from our opponent tapping out here. Thinking we're sitting on nothing in our hand. Now they're in trouble. If they had a Subtlety, that would have made sense, but as you'll see momentarily, they do not. Yawg resolves. We're going to start drawing some cards. Draw 4 cards. Play land, fetch. Up to put our Grist into play. Plus the Grist. Draw 2 more cards. Feeling pretty good right now. Swing for 3, put our opponent down to 7. Your go. Opponent starts with a Channeler. A 1/1 Channeler. Into an iteration. Sure. Spin your wheels, my friend. Play out a Hearse. Really not a big deal. They pass the turn back. Draw into our Dryad Arbor. We're going to lead on our Wall of Roots here. We have a line for lethal. Into our Ooze. Opponent chooses counterspell. We were expecting that. We're going to respond to the Surveil trigger before the Channeler has a chance to grow in power and toughness, so it can't crew the Hearse, kill it. See 2 creatures on top. We're going to put those both into our graveyard. We will activate Yawgmoth's Proliferate ability, discarding our Arboreal Grazer, plussing our Grist, and then minusing our Grist. GG's. And that does it for the league. That was a 4-1 finish. This list felt incredibly powerful. I was really happy with how it performed, and I will definitely be testing it again in the future. I'm excited to see what this list develops into. Stay tuned.